So today's topic of conversation is the relationship between personal growth and your business growth. Are those two related, and how can one impact the other? It's a topic that's often overlooked and in some cases quite counterintuitive. Can it really impact our success and lead to abundance and more prosperity? In this interview, we'll dive deep into one entrepreneur's journey and finding the balance between business growth and personal evolution. I'm very excited to introduce to you our guest today and Reboot member, Sophia Sunwoo. She's a third-time entrepreneur and the founder of Ascend Strategy. She's built and sold her first company by the time she was 22, before then launching a clean water nonprofit that fixes water projects in Cameroon and India, and has been recognized as a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree. She's been a speaker at TEDx, and she's also been named World's 100 Most Inspiring Women by Salt and Diageo. Her mission today is to help women-led startups articulate a clear vision and get great companies off the ground. So here we go. Welcome, Sophia. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's someone that I deeply admire and someone who really embodies growth in every sense and up-leveling at every turn. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad that you're finally doing this.
I'd love to actually take this opportunity to sort of rewind a little bit and reflect on your journey thus far. You've been in the startup game for about 13 years now, and I can imagine that you've been through quite the evolution as a business leader and as a person. And I would actually love to get a sense of your mindset, your motivation, and who you were at each stage of your entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, so it's definitely been a really long journey, especially because every single business was so different. When I first started my clothing company, I was 19 and I didn't know what I was doing. And that, I feel like that experience was strictly how do you kind of create a clothing company from scratch and do all of like the daily tasks you need to do to sell your clothing, do the marketing and all that stuff. So it was just like figuring out how to run just that business, right? And then when it came to my second business, which was a clean water nonprofit that functioned out of Cameroon and India, I started like kind of becoming aware of the shift that was happening, where it was less so. There was definitely like a lot of challenges when it came to how do I like operate this very specific business and how do I do all the things for this specific business, but starting to think about like, oh wait, like I have all these like mental blocks when it comes to growing this business. Like this is actually tugging on a lot of my insecurity. So that started like kind of speaking a bit to me, and it started getting a lot louder. And then after like I had built those two businesses, a couple of years had passed at that point. I would say like 9 years at that point. So with my current business, Ascend Strategy, kind of reflecting back, I really kind of see it as, oh my goodness, those two businesses, I literally kind of like jumped in a car, started driving from New York, like took a bunch of turns until I eventually ended up in California like 9 years later. Like it kind of felt like that after reflecting on it. Like, wow, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was really functioning from a place of like, I'm just gonna figure it out as I go, and there's really no structure to it. And I think that when it came to building this current business and just like reflecting on all of that, it gave me like the awareness to really reflect and say, I can't do that anymore. I can't do this hustle. I can't do this burnout. I need to function from a place where I have the awareness of the skeleton basically of how to create like a profitable business. So with this current business, it's just been like such a faster trajectory where I feel like I have the roadmap, and you know, that stuff that was kind of speaking to me earlier with my second business of like these mental blocks, these like personal blocks that were affecting me but I didn't want to listen to it because it's just a lot of work to do the inner work. And with this current business, I feel like in the last like year and a half, I feel like actually like when I went to Bali for the first time with you, that kind of like sparked everything. Just like really being inquisitive about like that line of questioning of how does my lack of personal work affect my business, and I realized that it affected it a ton. So I feel like with this current business, it's really been an exploration of like stop fooling around, like figure out the formula to like actually buckle down and do this work in a lot faster trajectory, and also like do the inner work, because when you're trying to up level at a level that you've never done before, it's just not gonna happen unless you do the inner work. So that's kind of been like the big theme for me, like with this current venture. So it's been so interesting because I think for a lot of people, when you tell someone like I'm an entrepreneur, they all kind of think like, oh, she just like creates things. But like for me, like every single startup was such a different journey for me and such a different experience. I feel like I've lived like multiple lives through these businesses.
With any sort of up leveling and evolution, most oftentimes like people only think about like the external like changes in jobs and like their titles, and they see forward momentum on the external kind of capacity. You know, that time between ventures, that time between chapters in all of our lives, and I know everybody else can totally relate as well. I just always referred to it as like these inflection points, these like moments that are so uncomfortable. It's like that period of unknown where you're like, I'm not happy where like I've been, it doesn't fit me anymore, and I kind of need to go somewhere else, and I need to push myself to another level. I just don't know what that is. And I know it took me like so many years of like heartache and taking wrong turns because I didn't take the time to figure out like the next step that was aligned with who I actually was. I didn't do any sort of personal development until sort of much later in the game. And you know, it really does, like you said, like it really reflects your business, and your inner growth like really is reflective of one another. And like taking yourself back to those in-between inflection moments, what happened during these inflection points? Or was there something like subtly that was evolving in the background, or like what exactly was happening in those inflection moments for you?
Yeah, so I think for me, the inflection points actually happens outside of the external transitions of going from one business to another. It actually happened, I think that like because I was so not in touch with my inner self back then, there was just like a lack of awareness of kind of pausing after selling a company and like understanding what that meant for me. It was almost like bypassing, like mental bypassing, like however you want to call it, where, oh, I did this big thing and now like I'm just gonna move on to the next thing. And I look back on that and I'm just always amazed, like, wow, like I've come such a long way. How could I have like sold this company and been just so numb to my feelings or awareness of self that I was just like, okay, whatever, like what's next for me? So I think that for me, it was more like in my second business where I was there for like 6 or so years. And I remember for me with my second business, I had these like end goals of like, I wanted so much recognition and I wanted people to know my name and all that stuff. And when that happened, there was like this stretch of months where I got a lot of recognition, and I literally hit like the biggest goal I had ever set for myself at the time. And I hit it and I was like, wow, this wasn't as exciting as I thought it would be. This is actually pretty boring. And so, you know, I like got this huge recognition, like so many people were calling me, telling me congratulations. And once I hit like that pinnacle that I had dreamed of for so long, and for it to feel so empty, I was just like, wow, what's wrong with me? Like, do I just not appreciate what I've accomplished? It almost felt like all the blood, sweat, and tears I had struggled through for like the past like X number of years, like it didn't validate it. And that was when I realized like, wow, there's something going on here. There's something wrong, and I need to really figure out what it is, because you don't hit you don't like get recognition of like the biggest thing that like most entrepreneurs dream of and feel like really sad about it, or feel like that's pretty boring. So I think for me, I realized like just how much of my ego was driving me in that business, and how inauthentic I was being with myself, and untruthful I was being with myself as far as like why I was in that business, and just like realizing like, wow, there's a lot of inner work I had to do, and I was almost creating like this like external complex, this external ego to like show that everything was okay when in fact it wasn't. And yeah, it was just like a lot of like me bypassing a lot of stuff, me ignoring a lot of things, seeking external validation because I didn't have that inner validation. So yeah, for me, like it was kind of one of those, I think like for me, like my experience continuously throughout my life has been, you will get like whispers of what you need to work on, and if you ignore it enough times, it'll come out as like a scream, and it'll hit you like a car out of nowhere. And that was my experience with that. So for me, like my inflection points previously were ended up being screams, and I think that with my current life where I'm at and like my current business, I'm trying to become more aware of like when whispers are happening, and trying to catch things before they become like big screams. So I think that when it comes to doing your personal work, it's really doing the personal work so that you can be brave enough to like answer those whispers and to really respond to them and explore them a bit.
I just got chills, like everything from when you said that if you reach the pinnacle of something and then you feel so empty inside, that's actually like the part of success that most people like don't talk about. They're like, oh, like I want to achieve this grand thing, but they don't actually think about what happens like after. Especially if something that you've been building is like built on a foundation rooted in ego, rooted in not actually who you deeply are at your core. If it's just like built on, you know, the I shoulds, or like this looks good, or this, you know, this will make somebody else proud, or this is what everybody else is achieving, like it does feel really empty. And like when you said the story about like these whispers that turn into kind of like hits and like whatever, I'm like, wow, that like resonates so deeply with me, because like I know that I've also experienced something similar where, you know, I kept ignoring sort of my own intuition, and it just kind of like kept coming and coming to the point that I was hospitalized because my body was just like enough. And that really kind of sparked me to kind of seek help. I started to go see a therapist, and then that kind of led me down a personal journey of like meditation and getting into mindfulness and spirituality and everything. I just kind of wanted to try like everything. I'm curious to know, like for you, when you started to notice this pattern of like the whispers turning into like the louder screaming, and you have these like giant moments of like inflection, at a certain point, like when did you decide like, okay, I need to like take control of this? How can I start working on these deeper, darker parts of ourselves, like these shadow sides of ourselves, which everybody deals with. I'm just curious to hear like how you approached it. I mean, did you work with like a coach, a therapist, or did you read just a lot of self-help books? Like, I would love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things, honestly. Like, I think that for me, when I really dug into kind of what is the inner work I need to do, I just realized that I had a lot of trauma I had to work through. I had like a lot of self-worth issues I had to work through. And I realized that all of it, just like how heavily it was bleeding into my business, like especially so for my current business, this is the first business I founded by myself. And like one thing I realized was for my first two businesses, I always had a co-founder. And creating this third business, I was super scared to do it on my own because I realized that I was basically had this belief that in order to start a successful business, I had to have a co-founder. And I just had this belief like there was no way that I could have a successful business with me just running it. So that was like a huge self-worth thing that I really had to kind of work on. And one big thing that I was seeing when it came to my business that I started seeing it like go affect things like pricing, where, for example, because my self-worth was so attached to my business, my current business, I was seeing that whenever I released like a product or a program, it felt so vulnerable because it was like my baby. And if you're creating something and you're saying like, this is like the thing I've spent months on and this is like my best creation and I want you to like see it, like that feels super vulnerable. And you know, again, it was like that validation aspect of like, here's like this thing I've worked on for super long, and I want people to like tell me it's great, and for people to like validate that it's a good thing I created. And therefore I would see myself doing things where I'd like lower the price in order to like get more people to buy and like get that hit of validation, like, oh, people like it because they're buying it. So I was seeing things like that where it's like, oh, like this is messed up, like I need to get some help because this is actually kind of violating these rules that I have for like my business and that I teach, you know, my clients as well when it comes to pricing and all that stuff, like not negotiating and like lowering your pricing to like such a crazy low state. So when I saw that it started violating like some of these principles that I taught like as someone that works with entrepreneurs, I knew that it was essentially going to ruin my business if I didn't tackle it right away. So yeah, for me, it's just been a lot of like work with my coach. It's been a lot of like personal development work that has nothing to do with business, and it has more to do with understanding like the roots of where your definition of self-worth comes from, like what are the characteristics of that. Because I think like if your like self-worth compass is kind of like screwed up, like I say that with like the most love as possible, obviously. But for me, like I felt like my self-love compass was really screwed up, and just like understanding like the characteristics of my self-worth compass is comprised of a bunch of stuff that shouldn't be there, and just like having that awareness. So yeah, it's like it's like so much work, and it's so frustrating sometimes because I think that, you know, that's one layer, and then there's like this whole other layer of family relationships and how all that kind of plays into your business and being an entrepreneur. The retreats, like your retreat was so helpful and kind of like sparking my conversation as well with all this. I think that again, it's like the whisper versus screaming thing. Like the more that you can listen to those whispers and start taking action whenever you start hearing them, that's the key right there. Because when it comes to your life and like all of like the BS that you carry when it comes to like relationships, family, like friends, like all the stuff that you do that you see in your personal life where you're like, oh, I ghost a lot of people, like I should really stop doing that. Like when you have your own business and your self-worth is so attached to it, like your business just becomes a projection of all of that BS from your personal life in your business life. And what ends up happening is like you're basically like doubling your trauma and your BS like in two different places, and that gets so heavy after a while. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. And it's so funny, like as you were telling me about like, oh, I was basically repeating the trauma in two separate places, it just kind of made me laugh because it reminds me of like I think about I used to think about how like everything was like separate. I'm like a master compartmentalizer. I'm like, okay, great, like work is here and my emotions here and my family's here, like they will never touch, and like I could be all of the different things for the different situations, and it's normal. It is not normal. I am one person. I don't have multiple versions of me, and like if there are multiple versions of me, it does create like this inner like conflict and trauma, and you start to feel like inauthentic, and like you can't separate it out. Like you have to become the best version of you in order to be the best version of a leader, an entrepreneur, or a creator. It doesn't really matter. Like whatever you're putting out into the world is a direct reflection of like how you're feeling inside, like how you're thinking about the world, and like in your example of like ghosting, you're like, oh, like I don't do it just in my personal life, it shows up in other ways in like my business. And like, yeah, like for me, I think for me, like one of the worst like moments was when I realized that like I couldn't ask for help. Like I realized I'm like that with my family, I can't ask for help. I'm like, oh, I can do it everything myself, and like I'll DIY everything. And I realized it's showing up in my business too. It's like when I really struggled and I needed help, like it took a lot of like self-work and realization that I can't do this on my own. I do need like a group of people who really believe in the mission. I do need help. I need to like learn how to ask in a very like honest and vulnerable way, and ask for help. Like it's probably one of the hardest skills that I had to learn. I feel you on a deep level. Like speaking of like all of these like traumas and these like big moments that you kind of really had to like face yourself, and you know, there are like either situations or people that act as sort of a mirror or act as like an invitation to look deeper. For me, it always comes at like one of the worst times in my life. And it always like, that's when the biggest lessons come. That's when the biggest invitation comes to look at yourself. And for me, like that came when I got fired from my first startup job. I was devastated. I was a head of marketing. I had 10 years of marketing experience. And when I got fired, it really like shook me to my core. Like I started questioning my abilities. It like really dashed me as a person. And it was so weird because I thought it wasn't actually that big of a deal, like mentally, but emotionally, it felt like I was being rejected as a person. And what I found was like I was linking my identity with achievement. And if I wasn't achieving, and if my work and my output was zero, then I was zero. So yeah, like I'm just wondering if like you can share a story of like one of maybe your hardest or more difficult moments that you're like, oh wow, like this is a thing that I need to look at. Yeah, I mean, if you can share a personal story, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, so I think that with self-worth, that's probably an issue I've only overcome within like the past year. It's been such a long journey for me that, you know, the same thing, like the story I was mentioning before of like getting this like crazy recognition and award, and realizing that that wasn't it, that didn't make me feel good. Like that was a huge kind of bump and like wake up call for me, that like it's almost like trauma in a sense, where the things that are supposed to bump up your self-worth, when they don't, like what are you left with? And I think that's like almost worse than because then like if you don't understand like your North Star of what makes you happy, then what do you have? And then you're kind of like in a black hole of depression. So I think that when I realized that, and I was almost feeling lost in a sense, that like because this thing didn't give me validation, and it's like the thing that society tells me that I'm supposed to be validated by, then what do I have? And at that point I just really realized that I had to separate my self-worth from my business in order for it to get anywhere. I think that wrapping your self-worth into your business is fine up to a certain point, because it's like that initial spark that like pushes everything, right? But then if you don't detach when it's the right time, you end up in hustle, you end up burning out, you end up in this really like unhealthy state. Self-worth and wrapping my self-worth around my business, it was actually stopping me from hitting like my true potential, because the probability of failing, and that meaning that I would fail also, like the weight of that was so heavy that I was so scared to take big leaps with myself and my business. So it was stopping me from getting me to the next level. And when I realized that, I was just like, oh, like I need to let it go. I need to like start figuring out ways to detach myself from my business, because I will never get to the highest point that I envisioned for myself if I feel that if that attempt is out there and I fail, then I'm like super scared and I'm re-traumatized and I have to like hover in a corner and like call it the end. So yeah, I mean, like when it comes to working with other entrepreneurs, like I see so many like 100 different manifestations of this, where it's like when someone tries to negotiate you on price, like you back down and you like give them that negotiation. When someone is, it's like always like people related to, I feel like in a sense, but it like manifests in so many different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned like the mistake that a lot of entrepreneurs make is tying your self-worth to, I guess, like pricing and like how well your business is doing. In kind of a similar vein, I noticed that it's in like startup culture and businesses in general. You know, things like the grind and how much capital you raise and like how much profit you make, like these are all measures of success and measures of worth. Like from everything, you know, movies tell us this, like every business article tells us this, like you are what you know, output, you are what you eat what you kill. Like it's all very much like that mentality of like output always, and like your worth and your validation comes from the validation in the business world, like whether a boss tells you or whether customers tell you or whatever, like that is you. But you know, it's only because it's like measurable. I think people like to latch onto things that they can tangibly like understand, whereas things like you know, personal development, it's really kind of hard to like measure in the business sense. At least traditionally anyways. But I do believe that there is like a benefit of holistic development, not just you as a business person, but you as a whole person, and how it impacts, you know, the bottom line and how it impacts like your business. It's hard for like entrepreneurs like working in the weeds right now, you know, grinding day in and day out. You know, actually what you need to up-level your career is like stillness and more personal awareness. They would probably, I mean, I know I would have rolled my eyes 10 years ago if somebody told me that. I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever, carry on. And it's definitely like sort of, I think of myself like the younger me. It's like sort of a naive way of looking at it, because like just thinking of your business is not the full story. You know, I would love your take on this, to like, what for you have you seen as a positive impact as a result of inner work?
Oh my gosh, I feel like I can go on for an hour about this. I guess to like shorten it, so I've been working with Nina, who you know, for like a really long time. She's been like my coach, and one of the things we worked on was like I had like a real issue with doing the work that I like from a skill-based perspective I'm really good at, but I actually hate doing, and just letting go of that and really doing the work that was scary for me, but I absolutely loved. And with business plans and decks, like it was very much like an ego-driven thing, where it was like something that I thought I had to do because of my background and my expertise, and it's like a skill and a knowledge perspective that a lot of like new startup founders really want. And when I realized that I absolutely hated that, and I like didn't like working on those projects, and like one thing like Nina and I talked about was, Nina was like, you do realize like when things are wrong, like everything will be wrong, but when you pick the thing that lights you up and is truly reflective of the work you want to do, regardless of ego, regardless of what society says, like everything will be align and be perfect. And like that's exactly been my experience, where like when I was doing the thing I didn't want to do, I had a lot of people that like would ghost me and like didn't pay like the last part of our agreement, or like were really nasty to me for like X, Y, and Z reasons. And then as soon as I made the switch to like work that I really personally wanted to do on like a deep soul level, like everything was super easy. I'm working less and I'm making like double and like probably triple by the end of the year of what I was making before. And I think like like I don't really know how to explain that other than like just like doing the personal work, doing the exploration of like asking those questions for yourself and like being really honest and brave about what the true answer is and like what steps you need to take next, no matter how freaking scary it is. I think like that has been kind of like my most like poignant experience to date, like in regards to all that. When you were saying stuff about like when like entrepreneurs are first starting out, they're like looking for investment and like doing all of like the pitches and all that stuff. So what's been like really fascinating for me to observe is even that action is an insecurity. So a lot of entrepreneurs will right away beeline, like let's say they have this new startup idea, they want to start a company, they beeline towards getting investment and investors involved. And that to me is actually like a manifestation of your inner insecurity of wanting external validation that your business idea is good, rather than taking the route of I believe in myself and I believe in my idea, so I'm going to bootstrap this thing until I can bring in sales and do it that like way of actually building a sustainable business that can stand on its own 2 feet. So that's been like really fascinating for me. And I think that maybe that was why I actually like transitioned out of business plans and pitch decks, because I saw and felt that it was so misaligned with what I believe in, of like not requiring that external validation when you're trying to start your own business.
Like truly grounding down into like knowing your skills as a creator or an entrepreneur, and knowing that you can do it. And like that is a lot to do with confidence. And I'm so happy to hear that you've been working with Nina. And for those who don't know this woman, Nina is actually also a Reboot member, and Sophia and Nina met in my Reboot Bali experience. And yeah, like part of like, I love like hearing these stories of like collaborations and people like helping each other and working together afterwards. And like, that's such a beautiful thing. And I'm so happy to hear that you guys were able to really like work together and up level, not only just like your personal growth, but also like your business as well. So on that note, I actually want to wrap up with a final question, which would be really helpful, I think, to anyone who's sort of going through a similar time, a similar inflection point where they're like, oh, like questioning everything, wondering if the next step is the right step, and just really feeling like anxious or nervous about it. What would you say to somebody who's really questioning their next step, like, and they feel the urge to step into their next chapter, but they're hesitant or afraid, or they keep ignoring their inner voice? I mean, just a little bit longer. Like, what would you say to someone like this who's going through the weeds right now?
Yeah, so there's this thing I always tell my friends where when they're trying to like dump someone or they're trying to like move to another city, and I kind of feel like they're either running away or avoiding a situation, and I always tell them like, you do realize that it's not the person or it's not the city that you're currently in that's the problem. You do realize that this thing you're avoiding, this thing you're running from is always going to follow you. It's going to happen in the next boyfriend. It's going to happen in the next city. It's always going to pop up until you address it and resolve it for yourself. And I always find that to be like the same situation when it comes to like being at these intersections where you're trying to figure out what's next. If you don't take action, in my experience, like it will always like get louder and louder until it turns into a scream where it'll hit you in the face like from nowhere. It'll happen at the worst time. Like that's always been my experience. And like I always encourage people, like when you're at these intersection points, like even if it's a mini step where it will allow you to just like to think out of the box, to like get yourself out of your own brain. I think that's always like has been the biggest challenge for me. The moment that I internalize things and try to figure things out myself, I'm basically just like on a laundry cycle, just like regurgitating the same old thoughts, and I just don't get to a new place. So I think for me, like what's been super helpful is just like leaving my brain, like going outside of myself and looking and for those answers and explorations like somewhere else beyond me, because obviously if I knew the answer, then I would have figured it out already. And I think that I do retreats, like I work with a coach, like I read books, like all those things I think are so important. And having the awareness of, okay, I've read all the books, but nothing's changing, and like understanding when you need to take that additional step. And I think like at the root of all this, it's always action. Like that's like the key thing here. Like make sure that if you really are truly in a place where you feel lost and you don't know what to do next, like keep taking actions, because those actions are going to eventually take you to where you need to be. And that's always worked for me.
Awesome. Thank you. Actually, one more thing. Sorry, I lied. That was not the last question. It's just kind of when you were talking, it sparked something. So I know that you're an avid rock climber, and sometimes like self-work like doesn't always look like serious work. Like sometimes it could be like play, and sometimes it could be like just doing something that makes you feel good. And like, I mean, I would love to hear like if like rock climbing or like other activities, like nothing to do with, I guess, like your day job or deep inner self-work, like has that also impacted your personal growth as well?
Oh my gosh, like absolutely. I think that when it comes to really embodying this lesson of detaching your self-worth from your business, you have to find those like physical and mental activities that help you really accomplish that and to commit to that. So for me, rock climbing has just been so amazing, especially because rock climbing plays with your nervous system and your fears, and it's like things that you can't control, where you almost have to become like a master in controlling your mind and learning how to silence your mind. And I've definitely carried that over to like business stuff. It's just like so helpful to like unlock your brain and to like have it think from different spheres that you're not used to. And I think like rock climbing for me, it's just been like so interesting because it's one of those sports that you can't master by lifting a bunch of weights and like you'll become a master within like 2 years. Like in order to like hit like the upper tiers of climbing, you actually had to have like started climbing when you were like 8 years old, because your fingers aren't physically capable of building that muscle unless you put in a couple of decades into it. So I think like for me, the slowness of the sport, like how challenging it is, the fact that you're only able to master it by doing like little single steps every single day, like that's been really attractive to me. So like I think it's different for every person, where like different minds are stimulated by different activities. So kind of understanding that parallel for yourself, like if you're the type of business owner that's like me, where I'm really obsessed with like being meticulous and like putting in the long-term work and stuff like that, like understanding what the parallel is that for you, that you'll be equally as stimulated like outside of your work. Because I think where people trip up on is they get super bored like with their free time and they just go back to work because they haven't found that parallel of like the mental or physical activity that like aligns with the stimulation they find in their business.
Exactly. And like who you are is so much more than just like your business. It's like how you approach life, and like how you approach climbing is probably similar, and like you're learning something from seemingly a very different area of your life that you will see in your business and also even in your personal growth. So those are all related. And like for me, I mean, for you it's climbing. For me, I have this like lifelong obsession with surfing. It's like I love the dynamic aspect of it and how it's always a new problem to solve, and you get to play at the end of the day. So yeah, I totally hear you on that. It's not just the thing itself, and it's not just the physical component of it, but it's also sort of the mental challenge and the clarity that you get from getting into that state of flow of like just being hyper focused on something and not thinking directly about like the problem, or not thinking directly about your business challenges, but just kind of removing yourself and detaching yourself, like you said, from something where the solution, where like the problem and the solution might not necessarily come from the same place, but will benefit both.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's so important.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience. with your own personal growth journey and like how it's impacted your business. I'm sure this will be helpful to a lot of people who are questioning whether or not, you know, taking a pause and like going inward is like beneficial or not. It definitely is from the sound of it. So I really, again, appreciate your time. I will include a link to your website in case people want to find out more about what you're doing. If you're looking to, you know, build a business or grow and scale an existing business, Sophia is your girl. You can connect with her at ascentstrategy.com. And again, I'll include the link in the post.
Yeah, I'm also on Instagram, Ascent with Sophia. I do a lot of startup stuff every week there. I'm also going to Reboot Mexico in March. I don't know when this is coming out, so come. It's going to be super fun. And yeah, Hannah, thank you so much for the time and conversation. This was really fun.
If you loved this episode, you can connect with other like-minded, purpose-driven entrepreneurs like Sophia at a Reboot Experiences. If you're looking to reframe some of your biggest challenges and just have a little bit of fun. I think that's the point of living, right? To have a little bit of fun.